Hello friends, hope you're all well and ready for the next one. This is Granny's GodPod number 97, Abram and Sarai in Egypt. Have you ever read through a familiar Bible passage, accepting it without question, when one time it suddenly occurs to you to wonder, why is that piece included? In Genesis 11:26, Abram, otherwise known as Abraham, is introduced into the line of fire. Abram was a Sumerian. The 19 generations from Adam to himself were natives of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Nonetheless, he is classified as Hebrew and a patriarch of the Jewish race. Abram begins his journey by travelling with the family entourage from Ur to Haran, where they all stay until Abram's father Terah dies. Joshua 24:2 and 24:14-15 identifies Terah and possibly his family as worshipping many little g gods. Ur and Haran were also significant places for the moon worship cult. And many of the names from Genesis 11:29 stem from this false religion as well. Genesis 15:6 says, Abram believed in our big G God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. After his father's death, Abram is told by God to make his way to Canaan, the land chosen for his offspring. He sets off with his own family and servants, together with his nephew Lot. When they reach the Negev, there is a famine in the land. So Abram decides to make his way down to Egypt, which we know is a place of refuge in a time of famine. We might ask why Abram did not have enough faith to let God provide, but that is not necessarily a Jewish way of thinking. They might see that as testing God, which was unacceptable. They would take action themselves in a given situation, and God would only intervene when they made a mess of things, which we could argue is what Abram does. Someone once said to me that God only helps those who help themselves, which I don't believe is true, but I suspect the saying came from a very poor joke about a thief who exclaimed that God helps those who help themselves, that is, help themselves to things that are not theirs. It is rather in the same vein as the cheeky one about someone explaining their method of giving alms, which was to throw their coins into the air, and what God took he kept, and what came down he didn't need. But I digress. Since Abram and Sarai had the same father but a different mother, Sarai was both wife and sister. This means it was only a partial untruth when Abram, being concerned for his safety, perhaps not so much for hers seemingly, suggested the subterfuge of Sarai being known as his sister. Abram is revered as a patriarch, and we may not necessarily realise that he is in fact a flawed character, which, as we see with King David, does not prevent his use by God. Abram, in effect, prostitutes his wife twice for fear of his own life, this time in Egypt, the second time in Genesis 20 to Abimelech, when they reach Gerar in southern Canaan. In those days, a stranger coming into occupied territory might find family members being taken hostage to ensure good behaviour while they stayed in the land. And since they had no children, Sarai could have been that hostage. But it was likely more than that, because that would not explain why Abram feared for his life. A married woman was at risk of having her husband killed and then herself being raped and killed, whereas a single woman, perhaps especially one as beautiful as Sarai, could be given to a suitor with the brothers' agreement. This seems likely to be the reason that Pharaoh sent Abram gifts of donkeys and servants, flocks, herds, and even camels, in the hopes that these would be acceptable enough for Abram to agree to giving his sister into Pharaoh's keep. Since the gifts kept coming, we can see that Abram had not agreed, so we can assume that Sarai remained untouched. God also intervenes in the Abimelech situation, so that Sarai is kept safe in this respect. Having got Sarai and himself into this mess, Abram at that time must have been relieved and reassured when God intervened and sent plagues on Pharaoh. God needed to protect Sarai and facilitate the family's exodus from Egypt, which prefigures future events. We are not told how, but Pharaoh came to understand that the plagues were associated with Sarah's being in fact Abram's wife, and he sent them both packing out of Egypt, together with Abram's accumulated riches, herds, and people. In Genesis 17, we see that the couple are destined to become the ancestors of the Israelites, and as a symbol of this covenant with God, Abram becomes Abraham, which means father of a multitude, and Sarai becomes Sarah, which means princess or mother of nations. Abraham's story is narrated up until his death in Genesis 25:10. So in this passage, we discover that Abram is not perfect, and the pair do not always make the best decisions. But this shows us that we do not need to be perfect to be of use to God. It also shows that although our journey through life may not always be smooth, our Father is always able to intervene when we make a mess of his purpose for us. We might be as disobedient or uncooperative as Jonah was, or as impatient as Sarah was, but God is always able to bring us back to his purpose in the grand scheme of things. And if we are unsure of his purpose for us, we can always pray in Jesus' name for guidance. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.